Good afternoon and welcome to EUROMED Migration Talks. Every week we bring you a new perspective on migration narratives, about their development and their determining factors. I am your host, Marco Ricorda from the ICMPD-run EUROMED Migration Project. Today I will be talking to James Dennison, professor at the Migration Policy Center, which is a part of the European University Institute, where he leads the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, which is the first observatory to collect and produce comprehensive international data on public attitudes towards migration. James, how are you today?
Very well, very well. Thank you for having me. How are you, Marco?
I'm great. Where are you today?
Currently based in Madrid, so currently in the center of the second wave, but life still seems to be going on fairly well, and at least I have the beautiful weather here.
Well, that's at least one positive thing among a pretty difficult time that all over Europe and the world, many people are living, unfortunately. And we will address this also in the realm of migration in the few questions I've planned for you. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you lead the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration at the EUI, and its aim is to enhance the understanding of attitudes to migration through evaluation of data from all EU countries. Now, James, tell me this. How can a more informed use of data foster a balanced narrative on migration? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's really three steps in terms of how we see things at the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, and in general, how I would recommend approaching this topic for anyone who's interested in changing narratives or rebalancing narratives or simply just improving the quality of debate out there. So the first step, and one thing that we've done a lot in OPAM, that's what we call the observatory, is the first thing is to describe attitudes, simply to understand what are the attitudes out there, what do people think about migration, what do people think about the different types of migration. Once you describe what they are, you can compare. So you can compare how things are changing over time. You can compare countries to each other. As you say, we focus on European countries, but we actually bring together, for this comparative purpose, global data. And you can also compare individuals. So what types of individuals think different things? What types of attitudes vary, for example, because attitudes to migration, of course, it's not one single thing. It's actually a broad variety of different topics, different types of migrants, different types of migration regimes, attitudes to policy, attitudes to a range of different things. Anyway, so the first step is really to describe the situation, what's going on out there. Once you understand the empirical reality, you can move on to the second step, and that's explain variation. So why do countries vary in what they think? We already know how they think, but why does one country think one thing, another country have a certain level of attitudes to migration, a certain preference? You can do the same with individuals. You can do the same with across time. Why have attitudes varied across time? And once you understand why, which is no easy feat, actually, in many ways, it's the hardest thing we do in social science, moving from the empirical raw data to making theoretical causal claims. But once you do that, you're able to prescribe interventions. So you're able to say, okay, we know what attitudes are. We know why they are as they are. And therefore, we're able to say, if you do X, Y, or Z, you're likely to get this, this result. If you use a certain type of messaging, it's likely to elicit certain attitudes. If you have a certain migration policy, it's likely to elicit other attitudes. And that all comes from understanding, as I say, first, what is the lay of the land? What do people think? Why do they think that? And then the third and final step, as I say, what interventions are likely to change what they think?
I totally agree with you, especially when a debate is vastly generalized and as in the case for migration in Europe and the Mediterranean, vastly polarized, I think precision is exactly the key to explain each and every, let's say, situation, each and every element of the analysis. Otherwise, we risk even polarizing further the narrative. And about this, I'd like to ask you something very precise. So you often mention in your work value-based messaging. So what is value-based messaging, and what type of value-based messaging is likely to work when it comes to migration?
Yes, so this really goes back to a recent report with the ICMPD we put out. I would say it was about a month ago it came out, maybe a little bit more. When value-based messaging is a term that gets used a lot, and I think that's a really good thing, but I think people haven't really thought through what that means. People say, okay, you need to communicate in terms of emotion rather than facts. You need to use values rather than boring data, for example. And I suspect that's the case, or we suspected that's the case. So that's why we went down the route of producing this report, which says, okay, so what is value-based messaging? What type of value-based messaging is likely to work when it comes to attitudes to immigration? And we basically drew, rather than just vaguely talk about values, we looked to the psychology literature, political psychology, social psychology, psychology moreover. That literature is pretty conclusive, pretty unified in what values are. It defines values as people's basic motivational goals in life. So they're personal and they are deep-seated. They don't change that much over the course of your life. And they really dictate the choices that you make, the behavioral choices you make, and the attitudinal attitude you have to more specific things. So one very popular attitude value-based schema is that by a psychologist called Schwartz. That's what we use in this report. And he basically looked at values across the world, and he wanted to find those values which can be found in equal measure everywhere in the world. He was interested in the most fundamental values, not those caused by cultural idiosyncrasies or national histories, but those that can be found everywhere in humanity. And he narrowed those down to 10. I'm not going to go through the 10 now, but what psychologists thereafter have done with those 10 values is show which of those 10 values relate to people's attitudes to immigration. And 4 of them have been shown repeatedly to be particularly important. So universalism, on the one hand, that's one of the 10 values, generally makes people more pro-immigration. Universalism, value in universalism means that you value everyone being treated equally, and you see that as a top priority. And maybe you see that if you value universalism higher than the other 9 values, you really want to prioritize that. Then there are 3 values which lead to more anti-immigration sentiments, as has been shown through all kinds of studies. And those are conformity, valuing conformity, that everyone should follow the same rules, everyone should follow the same sort of norms, and the way they live should be fairly homogenous. Tradition, which is similar to some extent, and also finally security, which is a little bit different. That's more to do with really seeing the top priority in life is feeling safe, feeling that there's no threat to you or your family. And so once we understand that these values, these deep-seated psychological motivations that you have affect your attitudes to immigration, we can say, okay, that's therefore likely value-based messaging using these type of values. We should keep those 4 values in mind. So we should think about, if we're trying to appeal to those people who are already pro-immigration, then we want to use those kind of universalistic values. However, if we want to appeal to those who are more anti-immigration, then we need to move away from those kind of universalistic way of thinking and start using values in the way that we message that speak more to those concerns about security, about conformity, about tradition. I think one thing that's important to remember from a psychological point of view is that none of those 10 values are right or wrong. It's not that universalism is better than the others or higher or anything like that. It's just that humans, for evolutionary reasons or whatever, vary in the extent to which they value these things. And that's probably a healthy thing. That means that we have a sort of healthy mix when we make decisions collectively, healthy mix in terms of perspectives. So if we think about messaging in terms of, if we want to appeal to those people in the middle who theoretically, I think we could say, are more likely to be persuaded in one direction or the other, we show in that report that, just as we would expect from the literature, they have a pretty balanced value set. So they do value universalism, but they also value those other three pretty much equally, those other three values of conformity, tradition, and security. So finally, what we then did in the report was go through a collection of examples of messaging that the ICMPD generously provided, of 150 or so campaigns. And we found that most of them was pro-immigration, but there were many that were also anti-immigration, but there was a clear pattern which emerged in terms of values. First, anti-immigration messaging is usually uses values. And that makes it particularly explosive. That's why we've had this sort of polarization, because you're speaking to people's deep-seated psychological makeup, something that they're not going to change very easily. However, the pro-immigration messaging pretty rarely uses values. And when it does, it predominantly does so purely in universalistic terms. So it's really speaking to those people who are already likely to be pro-immigration. And it might actually alienate those who are in the middle, or who, of course, already have anti-immigration attitudes. So it's really just an example of the description, explanation, intervention, 3 steps that I talked about at the start. We understand that people with different attitudes to immigration hold different values, and therefore we can design an intervention around what we already know in terms of explanation. This was just an example of that kind of value-based messaging.
So actually all the information about your publication, it will be published in our social networks. You can just see it in the comment section in the description. What I liked about your publication is that the analysis of values that you make, starting from Schwartz's research, can be applied to a number of issues. And then basically what I find interesting also as a member of ICMPD is that it really fits the migration narrative today, and what you say can easily find a practical, I can say, example. As you said, talking about practical examples, in your study you analyzed quite a few pro-migration campaigns, as well as we can also call them anti-migration campaigns. Now, you mentioned a few things earlier, but what are your main findings? So if we go back to the actual campaigns you have at your disposal, okay? And if you had to tell me in a nutshell, what is the difference between them? You mentioned already that there seems to be a larger availability of pro-migration campaigns compared to anti-migration ones. And then there is different ways values are triggered or somehow mentioned. What are your other main findings looking at these campaigns? Also, can you tell me more about, how were these campaigns collected?
Yes, so in terms of the main findings, I would say in a nutshell, pro-immigration campaigning has typically not used values. And when it has used values, it's used the wrong values. At least it's used those which are unlikely to persuade those in the middle, and certainly not going to persuade those who are already anti-immigration, because it's focused on universalism. By contrast, anti-immigration messaging has used values much more, although we have fewer examples, to be honest, in this inventory. But when it has, it's not only used values more, but it's also managed to use cleverly, I think, those values typically associated with pro-immigration sentiment, so framing themselves as those who are really in favor of tolerance, for example, which is a form of universalism. When it comes to the inventory, I wasn't responsible for collecting that. I don't think the ICMPD or anyone who was in charge of putting it together is claiming that it's in some way representative of all the messaging out there. It's really just about getting concrete examples to apply to the theory. So we could get many more, for example, examples of anti-immigration messaging from right-wing political parties or whatever it may be. But I suspect it would show more of the same. And bear in mind, the goals between anti-immigration campaigners are often quite different from pro-immigration campaigners. If they just want to get 20% of a vote, they can do that just by focusing on a few people with extreme values. The same can't be said for those who are trying to convince a whole population, of course, which is usually the pro-migration campaigns.
What you just said also highlights the importance of analyzing the narrative. In migration policy making for many years, I would say prior to the past 5 years, the narrative was a slightly underestimated topic. But what is clear today is that the narrative, so the way the topic has been discussed, also influences policymaking, and as you have pointed out in your previous reports with ICMPD, also electoral outcome. Now, let's try to help our colleagues that work in communicating migration. And I'd like to ask you, how can communicating policies that are concordant with the values of target audiences help rebalance the migration narrative in the Mediterranean? Is it possible? What would be your advice?
I think it is possible. I mean, values is just one way to do that. There's all sorts of other determinants of attitudes to immigration. So I wouldn't recommend only taking a values-based approach, but I would say it's a useful start. And then as I say, there's really three, if you're trying to move people away from the really anti-migration way of seeing things, that are going to help. And it doesn't take much imagination to see how that would work in the Mediterranean, for example. So security is a huge issue for those who are most concerned about immigration. So those fears shouldn't be dismissed. They should be constructively engaged with, I would say. And I would also say the same is really for conformity and tradition. That it can be shown that migration doesn't need to be a threat to these things. It can even be a way of upholding them. We show some examples of in the report, some examples of migration campaigns that use tradition and conformity to make a pro-immigration point. You know, that the migration can support those social institutions or whatever it may be that we typically associate with sort of national conformity or traditions or whatever it may be. So I think in the report we offer quite a few different really practical examples, but that's really just the starting point. But as I say, I don't think it requires that much imagination to think about how these values can be used once they're properly identified, which I think we've done.
But you know, here comes the $1 million question. So in the study and in what you just said, you claim that aligning migration policy communication with a target audience's value is likely to elicit sympathy for the message. And as you said, you know, you also mentioned examples where conformity can also feed into a pro-migration narrative. Now, do you have any suggestion for communication professionals? So not people that are making policies, but people that are communicating policy, not people that are analyzing policy making and societal changes, but they're actually communicating policies again, or these changes in order to rebalance this narrative which today is strongly polarized. Do you have any suggestion for communication professionals in order for them to incorporate values into their messages? Perhaps there is something interesting that you have found during your research. What is your experience with that?
Well, perhaps the best answer I can give to that is to think in terms of examples. So I'll give two examples, one which I think is likely to be fairly ineffective, one which is likely to be more effective when you look at it through that values-based framework, theoretical framework. So the one that would be ineffective would be simply saying, let's celebrate diversity. And this was really, I think, for a long time, the approach of migration campaigners, much less so now, I must say, because it assumed that other people have the same values as those putting the message together. So it just assumed that that sort of universalistic message of celebrating diversity would be effective for everyone. When actually, when you consider that those who are anti-immigration are all balanced in the middle, those are typically you want to be aiming at, because that's where most people actually are. When you consider their values in Schwartz's framework anyway, they value conformity. So telling them that this is going to bring more diversity is probably quite a bad idea. Now I'll give an example, if I can explain it verbally, it's not so easy, but of a migration campaign that I thought was quite effective. So there's actually a German one. There are examples in the UK and there are examples in the report as well. However, this German one showed a German man on a coast guard on a boat at sea. And he was accompanied by a younger man, also dressed as a coast guard, who looked like they were from Syrian, or perhaps somewhere in the Middle East descent. And that was really effective because they had one speech bubble saying, next to the older man saying, we have to protect Germany. And then the other one said, yes, let's do it together. So why that was effective, I think, in terms of values was because it showed how migration can support, in this case, conformity, tradition, security. It's a coast guard, so it's dealing with issues of safety and security. Any of those kinds of old professions, those traditional professions are forms of tradition anyway, particularly with that kind of apprentice and master relationship. And then finally, they were wearing uniforms. So what more could suggest conformity than that? The underlying message was, this isn't a threat. This is going to support the way of life as it currently exists. It's not going to change everything. It's actually just a way to support those values. So I don't know if that answers your questions with two examples. But,
it does very well. I think you're addressing a massive elephant in the room of communicating migration today, which is analyzing exactly the role of values and how these can play a role in rebalancing the narrative. And as you said earlier, too often a certain value has been used towards the wrong audience. And created, of course, a sentiment of fear sometimes, of lack of security, of threat. Even today, I think that COVID-19 brought a new threat, which is a sanitary threat. So I think I really like this conversation because you addressed the elephant in the room for all those working in communicating migration. James, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. All your publications will be available in the comment section and in the description of this video. This is all for today's episode of EUROMED Migration Talks. We thank again our guest, James Dennison, joining us from Madrid, the head of the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration. James, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'd like to say that James will be involved in other future works of ICMPD, and namely of the EUROMED migration project, which is going to run for a few more years yet. To all our followers, you can watch again this interview on all our social networks, and we'll see each other next week for another episode of EUROMED Migration Talks. Thank you very much and have a great evening.